Ines had always been the heart of her family, a loving mother who sacrificed everything to raise her children. As her birthday approached, she prepared for a celebration filled with hope, imagining her children and grandchildren gathered around her. But as the hours passed, her home remained silent, and her children never arrived. Her heart ached, realizing that the family she had nurtured had forgotten her. A lonely tear fell as she sat in the dim light, surrounded by memories of a life devoted to others. However, the arrival of her niece Laura brought a glimmer of comfort to her sorrowful day. Together, they devised a plan to teach her children the importance of love and family. Ines would fake her death, believing that drastic measures were necessary to rekindle the bonds that had once held them close. As news of Ines' passing reached her children, they were shocked and guilt-ridden. Each embarked on tasks designed to humble them, forcing them to confront the realities of life they had long ignored. Slowly, Carlos, Gabriela, and Martine began to change, rediscovering empathy, humility, and a sense of purpose that they had lost in their pursuit of success. When the truth finally emerged, Ines faced a new challenge. The lesson she had hoped to teach had worked, but at a great cost. The pain of deception weighed heavily on everyone. In the end, her family was brought together not by wealth or inheritance, but by the rediscovery of love and the realization of what truly mattered in life. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. No one showed up for Dona Ines' birthday celebration, leaving her heart heavy with disappointment. But little did her children know, they would soon face an unexpected revelation when they gathered months later to hear her will. What they anticipated never came to pass, and the words they heard shook them to their core. That day, the vanity mirror reflected Ines' weathered yet noble face, each wrinkle telling stories of hardship and resilience. Her frail hands, marked by time and labor, trembled as she gently pinned the last piece of her silvery hair into place. In that solitary moment, her reflection stared back at her, echoing a life that had known both love and loss. The room where she stood was steeped in memories, each corner a silent witness to the joys and sacrifices of her life. Family photos adorned the walls, capturing moments frozen in time. Her eyes lingered on the images of her 3 children: Carlos, the accomplished lawyer whose career overshadowed all else; Gabriela, forever entangled in her glamorous social life; and Martine, tirelessly chasing success in the business world. A bittersweet blend of pride and sorrow flickered in her gaze as she reflected on the years spent raising them single-handedly after her husband's untimely death. With a deep sigh, Ines pushed herself to her feet and made her way to the kitchen. The comforting aroma of a freshly baked cake, a recipe her children once adored, wafted through the house, filling the air with nostalgia. On the dining table, 3 neatly wrapped gifts sat waiting for her grandchildren. As she lovingly traced her fingers over the glossy paper, she imagined their laughter and bright smiles, a warmth filling her heart despite the emptiness surrounding her. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the silence, making her heart race with hope. Perhaps it was Carlos calling? Or maybe Gabriela from Paris. A flicker of joy ignited within her, and in her eagerness, she nearly stumbled as she rushed to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" she answered, her voice laced with anticipation, brimming with longing. But on the other end was not the voice of her beloved child. Instead, a stranger spoke. "Mrs. Ines, I'm calling to confirm your medical appointment for next week." Ines' hopeful smile faded, replaced by a familiar loneliness that crept in like an old friend. "Yes, thank you," she replied softly, her voice barely a whisper as she gently placed the phone back on the receiver. The room felt quieter now, the air heavy with anticipation that slowly dissolved into doubt. Ines made her way back to her favorite armchair, her gaze locking onto the wall clock as if willing time to move faster. Yet, each tick seemed agonizingly slow, a painful reminder of the minutes slipping away. Doubt crept into her thoughts, clouding the hopeful smile she had held onto. Could her children have forgotten her birthday? No, that was impossible. They would surely arrive soon, arms full of surprises. It had to be that way, she convinced herself, clinging to the hope like a lifeline. The clock struck 7 p.m., its chime resonating through the emptiness of the room. Ines didn't flinch, her eyes still fixed on the front door, waiting, hoping. The table, set with care for a celebration that never arrived, seemed to mock her with its untouched plates and perfectly placed cutlery. The cake, once fresh and fragrant, now began to stale, mirroring the fading of her hopes. Her wrinkled hands held a card she had written for herself. A small, heartbreaking gesture. "Happy birthday, Mom." The irony hit her with a force she wasn't prepared for, and a solitary tear slipped down her cheek, carving a path through the lines that years of life had etched into her face. The house was silent, save for the occasional beep of her phone. Messages from well-meaning acquaintances and distant neighbors, but nothing from the ones who mattered most. With a deep sigh, Ines stood up, her movements slow and deliberate as the weight of her solitude bore down on her. She shuffled towards the window, leaning on the sill for support. Outside, the streetlights blinked on one by one, casting a soft glow over the quiet street. Families bustled about, returning home for the evening, their laughter floating through the air from the nearby park. It was a scene of warmth and connection, one that seemed to mock her isolation. She sighed once more and returned to her chair, picking up the old photo album she had lovingly prepared to share with her children that evening. With trembling hands, she opened it, flipping through pages filled with memories frozen in time. There was Carlos, beaming with pride at his university graduation. Gabriella, radiant on her first runway show. Martine, shaking hands after closing his first big business deal. These were the moments she had cherished, the milestones she had celebrated as a mother. But now, looking at these photos, she couldn't help but wonder, where had those children gone? The ones who used to run to her with open arms, full of love and excitement? When had they drifted so far away? Just then, the phone rang again, piercing through the silence like a lifeline. Ines nearly lunged for it, her heart pounding in her chest with renewed hope. Could it be one of them? Could this be the call she had been waiting for all day? Carlos? Gabriella? Martine? She asked, her voice trembling with desperation, barely able to contain the longing she had been trying so hard to keep at bay. "Good evening, ma'am. We're calling to offer you an incredible deal on cable services." The monotonous voice droned on the other end of the line. Ines said nothing as she quietly hung up, the weight of reality crashing down on her like a heavy stone. The truth she had been avoiding all day hit her with full force. Her children, the ones for whom she had sacrificed everything, had forgotten her on what should have been the most meaningful day of the year. The tears she had fought so hard to hold back now flowed freely, hot and bitter, as she sobbed silently, her frail body trembling with every ragged breath. The night crept on, and with it, the heartbreaking certainty that she would spend her birthday completely alone. The oppressive silence that filled her house was suddenly broken by a soft, hesitant knock on the door. Ines' heart leaped in her chest, a fragile mix of hope and fear flooding her as she slowly made her way to the entrance. When she opened the door, she found herself staring into the warm, kind eyes of her niece, Laura. The young woman stood there with a small box of pastries in her hands, her gentle smile a stark contrast to the sadness reflected in Ines' weary gaze. "Happy birthday, Aunt Ines," Laura said softly, stepping inside the house. The gesture, so simple yet so full of love, pierced Ines' heart. As they sat together in the kitchen, sharing coffee, the stark contrast between Laura's thoughtful visit and the glaring absence of her children weighed heavily on Ines' mind. Gratitude mingled with deep, aching pain as Ines recounted the day to Laura in a shaky voice. How she had waited and waited, hopeful that her children would walk through the door at any moment. "I just don't understand," Ines whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched the coffee cup. "How could they forget me like this?" Laura reached out and took her aunt's hand, offering a wordless comfort that spoke volumes. As their conversation continued, it became painfully clear just how distant Ines' children had become. Laura's quiet kindness highlighted the stark contrast between her humility and the arrogance of her cousins, who seemed to have forgotten the importance of family in their pursuit of status and success. "Your cousins. They've lost sight of what matters," Laura said gently, her voice tinged with sadness. "They're so wrapped up in their own lives that they've forgotten the true value of family." Ines nodded slowly, the weight of Laura's words settling deep in her heart. She had seen it too, how her children, blinded by ambition and the pursuit of wealth, had distanced themselves from the very person who had given everything for them. Memories of past slights flooded her mind, her children's disdain for her humble upbringing, their condescending remarks, their growing detachment. Yet, despite it all, she had continued to love them unconditionally. But now, as she looked at Laura, something began to shift within her. A new perspective was taking root, one that challenged the deep-seated belief that her sacrifices had been worth it. The night passed with the two women sharing stories, and for the first time that day, Ines found herself laughing. Laura's presence had brought a glimmer of light to what had been an unbearably dark day. When it was time for her to leave, Ines walked her niece to the door, watching as she disappeared down the street. As she closed the door behind her, a newfound determination flickered in Ines's eyes. This day, as painful as it had been, had opened her eyes to a truth she could no longer ignore. Things couldn't continue as they were. It was time for a change, and Ines would make sure it happened. As she sank back into her armchair, the memories of her life surged forward with a relentless intensity. Faces, moments, and emotions flooded her mind like a storm that refused to pass. She saw Carlos, her firstborn, proudly receiving his law degree. How she had worked late into the night for years to afford his prestigious education, believing that his success would be the ultimate reward for her sacrifices. The image of his beaming smile that day now clashed painfully with the reality of his absence. Then there was Gabriella, her radiant daughter, always chasing dreams of glamour and success. Ines remembered the countless nights spent hunched over a sewing machine, crafting dresses for her daughter's fashion shows. Gabriella had achieved everything she had ever wanted, but at what cost? The once frequent phone calls had dwindled to rare, perfunctory conversations, replaced by impersonal bank transfers that felt cold and distant. And Martin, her youngest, his ambition had always been a source of pride for Ines. She had mortgaged the house to help him start his business, believing that his determination would lead him to greatness. And it had. Martin had become a successful businessman, but with every step up the ladder, he seemed to drift further away, each success adding another layer of distance between them. The sacrifices Ines had made for her children seemed endless, a lifetime spent putting their needs before her own. Birthdays spent alone, vacations postponed, dreams set aside, all to ensure her children had the best opportunities life could offer. And now, the inheritance she had so carefully preserved, the legacy of generations of hard work, had become the foundation for her children's luxurious lifestyles. Yet they had forgotten her, the very person who had made it all possible. With great effort, Ines stood up and made her way to the shelf where she kept the family photo albums. Her hands trembled as she opened one of them, her eyes scanning the images that told the story of her family's journey. The once innocent, joyful faces of her children slowly morphed into harder, more distant expressions as the years went by. One photo in particular caught her eye. It was from the last Christmas they had spent together 5 years ago. Carlos was checking his watch impatiently, Gabriella was absorbed in her phone, and Martin seemed more interested in the gifts than in the family around him. It was at that moment that something inside Ines broke, and at the same time something else hardened. Her sadness was replaced by a fierce resolve, a determination that she hadn't felt in years. Her eyes, once clouded with disappointment, now gleamed with new strength. "This has to change," she muttered to herself, closing the album with a sharp snap. "And I'll make sure it does." The dim light of the living room wrapped around Ines and Laura, casting shadows that seemed to hold their secret, intensifying the moment of shared conspiracy. Determination blazed in the old woman's eyes as she laid out her bold, almost audacious plan to her niece. Laura, though visibly unsure, couldn't deny the loyalty she felt toward her aunt. She sat quietly, her mind racing with the implications of what was about to unfold. "I'm going to fake my death, Laura," Ines declared, her voice steady and resolute. There was no hesitation, No tremor of doubt, only a calm certainty that took Laura by surprise. It's the only way they'll wake up to what they've become, to see the truth they've ignored for so long. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she absorbed the weight of her aunt's words. But Aunt Inez, don't you think this is too extreme? Faking your death. No, Laura, Inez interrupted, shaking her head with the same unyielding determination that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. They've lost sight of everything that truly matters. Family, love, humility, they've forgotten it all. They need a lesson that will shake them to their core, something they can't ignore or brush aside. Laura could see there was no swaying her. Together, they began drafting a new will, one that would turn the lives of Inez's children upside down. Inez spoke with quiet authority while Laura jotted down every word, her hands steady despite the enormity of the task. Each detail, every stipulation, was imbued with meaning, each test designed to confront her children with the harsh realities they had long avoided. Carlos will work as a janitor in a nursing home, Inez said softly, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. Perhaps, in cleaning the messes of others, he'll rediscover the humility he's so carelessly discarded. Gabriella, Inez continued, her voice firm yet tinged with sadness. Gabriella will live for a month on minimum wage. It's time she steps outside her bubble of wealth and luxury to see the world as it truly is. And Martine, she hesitated, the strength in her voice wavering for the first time that evening. Martine will care for children in an orphanage. Maybe then, he'll remember what it means to love without expecting anything in return. As the night crept on, the plan began to take shape with an unsettling clarity. Laura watched her aunt, a mix of admiration and concern swirling in her heart. Inez was unwavering in her resolve, but Laura couldn't help but feel the weight of the consequences that would follow. Are you sure, Aunt? Laura asked one last time, her voice low and filled with concern. Once this starts, there's no turning back. The pain, it could be irreversible. Inez nodded, her gaze steely, focused on the future she was determined to create. It's necessary, Laura. Sometimes love demands the hardest of decisions. This is the only way to bring them back to what truly matters. With the first light of dawn creeping through the curtains, Inez signed the new will, her hand surprisingly steady, as if the act itself solidified her conviction. Laura, still processing the enormity of their actions, called the family's trusted lawyer, a man who had known Inez for decades. Upon hearing the plan, the lawyer hesitated, but eventually agreed, albeit reluctantly. He understood the pain driving Inez to such lengths. As the sun rose over the city, Inez and Laura exchanged a look filled with unspoken emotions. The wheels were set in motion, and with them, the hope that this drastic act would somehow heal the fractures within the family. News of Inez's death spread quickly, like wildfire consuming dry brush, reaching across 3 continents and piercing the seemingly perfect lives of her children. In New York, Carlos was in the middle of an important meeting at his prestigious law firm when the call came through. His typically calm and composed demeanor faltered. His face turned ashen as the news hit him like a physical blow. With trembling hands, he excused himself from the room, ignoring the curious stares of his colleagues. "Are you sure, Laura?" he asked, his voice barely audible, his mind already tormented by the call he never made on his mother's birthday. The weight of regret settled heavily on his chest. In Paris, Gabriella was enjoying a luxurious salt bath at an exclusive spa when her assistant interrupted with the news. For a brief moment, her carefully constructed facade of indifference crumbled, and genuine pain surfaced in her eyes. She hastily climbed out of the tub, water splashing onto the marble floor, as memories and guilt flooded her mind. "Cancel all my appointments for the week," she ordered, her voice betraying the crack in her composure. "I need to go home." Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Martine was on the verge of closing the most significant deal of his career when the message reached him. The champagne bottle in his hand, ready to celebrate his latest success, was forgotten as he processed the news. His usual air of confidence and ambition darkened, replaced by a hollow feeling of remorse. "I'm sorry, we'll have to postpone the celebration," he muttered to his partners, their puzzled expressions lost on him as he left the room. Each of them, in their corner of the world, felt the sharp sting of loss mixed with the bitter aftertaste of regret. They had built lives of wealth, status, and power, but at that moment, all of it seemed insignificant. Ines, their mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for them, was gone. And with her death, they were forced to confront the painful truth they had been avoiding for far too long. Despite the shock of hearing about their mother's passing, none of the three children rushed to make immediate travel arrangements. Each remained tangled in their complex webs of commitments, obligations, and, perhaps, a reluctance they wouldn't admit even to themselves. They rationalized their delay with excuses that only deepened the emotional distance between them and their mother. Meanwhile, back in their hometown, Laura found herself shouldering the heavy burden of coordinating the fake funeral. Each condolence she received from neighbors and friends weighed more heavily on her conscience, filling her with guilt for deceiving people who had genuinely cared for Ines. Alone in her hotel room each night, Ines monitored everything through Laura's updates. Every message, every detail of her children's reactions cut her deeply, but she clung to her conviction that this pain was a necessary path to true healing. The tension reached its breaking point when the children began inquiring about the will. Their priorities became painfully clear as their questions centered more on inheritance than on honoring their mother's memory. This harsh reality only confirmed to Ines that her drastic plan, as heartbreaking as it was, had been necessary. Their focus on wealth, rather than grief, made her realize that their values had strayed too far, and only a shock of this magnitude might bring them back. The fake funeral became an intricate blend of real emotions and carefully orchestrated deception. Laura, carrying the secret like an unbearable weight, moved among the mourners with the grace of a seasoned actress, her face a perfect mask of controlled sorrow. Ines, once quiet, often forgotten home, now buzzed with life. Neighbors and old friends came in waves, their expressions of genuine sadness a striking contrast to the conspicuous absence of Ines' children. Ines was the heart of this neighborhood, Mrs. Martinez sobbed, her eyes red with tears as she clasped Laura's hand. She always had a kind word, always knew how to lift our spirits. Laura nodded, fighting back her own emotions. Every heartfelt compliment, and every shared memory from the neighbors, deepened the ache inside her. It was a stark reminder of the immense love Ines had poured into her community, a love that her children had taken for granted, if they even noticed it at all. The most nerve-wracking moment of the day arrived when Dr. Ramirez, Ines' longtime physician, walked through the door. Laura felt her stomach drop, fear rippling through her as she struggled to keep up the charade. "I'm so very sorry, Laura," the doctor said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "Your aunt was an extraordinary woman. It's hard to believe she's gone so suddenly." Laura forced a smile, the words catching in her throat. "Thank you, doctor. It was very sudden for all of us," she managed to say, her mind racing to maintain the facade. Upstairs, hidden from the world, Ines watched everything unfold through a small camera. Every tear shed by her neighbors, every kind word spoken about her, was a bittersweet balm to her heart. It affirmed that she had touched lives, that she had mattered, even as it deepened her sorrow that her children were not there to witness it. But it also strengthened her resolve to see this plan through to the end. The tears shed by those who truly cared about her, contrasted with the apathy of her children, only solidified her determination to force a change in them. As the day dragged on and the mourners eventually left, Laura found herself suffocating under the weight of her guilt and doubt. Was all of this pain truly worth it? Could such drastic measures achieve the transformation that Ines was so desperate to see in her children? By the time night fell, and the house was finally empty, Laura climbed the stairs to the small room where Ines was hiding. She found the old woman sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness, her face streaked with tears that had fallen in silence. "Aunt," Laura whispered, her voice full of concern. "Are you sure you want to keep going with this?" Ines didn't turn around at first, her gaze fixed on the distant streetlights flickering outside. When she finally spoke, Her voice was soft but filled with an unyielding resolve. "Yes, Laura. We've come too far to turn back now. Sometimes, love requires us to take the hardest path. This is for their good, even if it breaks my heart in the process." Laura's heart ached as she watched her aunt, the weight of the deception and the pain it had caused pressing down on them both. But she understood. Ines wasn't doing this out of malice or spite. She was doing it out of love. A love so deep that she was willing to endure unimaginable suffering if it meant her children would finally see the error of their ways. As Laura sat down beside her aunt, the two women shared a moment of silent reflection. Outside, the world continued oblivious to the turmoil inside that small room. But within those walls, Ines was preparing herself for the final act of her grand plan. A plan that, if successful, might just bring her fractured family back together. Ines turned to her niece, her eyes glistening with a mixture of pain and unshakable resolve. "More than ever, my dear. Today, I've felt more genuine love and respect from strangers than I have from my children in years. It's time they learn the true value of family, even if it means they must suffer to understand." Just then, Laura's phone vibrated, breaking the heavy silence. It was a message from the lawyer. The envelope containing the will's instructions had been sent to the law firm. The game, with all its emotional stakes, had officially begun. The day of the will reading arrived, gray and oppressive, the heavy clouds overhead mirroring the tension that lay thick in the air. The lawyer's office, usually a space of cold professionalism, seemed to vibrate with the undercurrent of unease. Carlos, Gabriella, and Martine, siblings who had not been in the same room together for years, sat in awkward silence. Their faces bore the marks of fatigue from long flights and the inner turmoil they were trying desperately to hide. Yet, the guilt that clung to them was almost palpable, mixing with the fear of what was to come. Laura, positioned in a corner as the executor of the will, observed her cousins with a complex blend of pity and disdain, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The lawyer, a seasoned professional and now a reluctant participant in Ines' plan, entered the room with the sealed envelope in hand. His expression was carefully neutral, but the weight of the moment was not lost on him. "Before we proceed," he began, his voice calm but with an edge of tension, "I must inform you that the contents of this will are unconventional." The siblings exchanged puzzled and uneasy glances. Carlos, ever the one to take charge, cleared his throat and leaned forward, his tone authoritative yet strained. "What exactly do you mean by unconventional?" Without answering directly, the lawyer broke the seal and began to read, his voice steady despite the charged atmosphere. As he detailed the conditions of the will, shock rippled through the room. Each sibling was assigned a task, a challenge that struck at the heart of their complacency and pride. Carlos, the eldest, accustomed to the power and prestige of his law career, found himself standing in the foyer of the Golden Sunset nursing home. The smell of disinfectant and the unmistakable scent of aging hit him like a physical blow. A nurse, her exhaustion evident in the deep circles under her eyes, handed him a janitor's uniform and a bucket filled with cleaning supplies. "The bathroom on the second floor is clogged," she informed him curtly, without a trace of sympathy. "Start there." Carlos hesitated, his hands trembling as he held the mop. The uniform felt alien on his body, a stark contrast to the designer suits he normally wore. With every swipe of the mop, every stubborn stain on the mirror, he felt his pride crumble, piece by piece. Each task was a bitter reminder of how far he had fallen from the pedestal he had placed himself on. Meanwhile, Gabriella, the glamorous socialite, found herself in a rundown neighborhood supermarket, clutching a shopping list in one hand and a handful of crumpled bills in the other. The store was far removed from the high-end boutiques she usually frequented. Her bare face, free of the usual layers of makeup, revealed the bewilderment in her eyes as she wandered through the aisles. "What do you mean you don't take credit cards?" she exclaimed in disbelief at the checkout, her voice tinged with frustration and panic. The line behind her grew longer, the impatient stares of the other customers making her feel small, insignificant, and vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. Martín, the youngest, arrived at the New Hope orphanage with a sense of dread. His plan was simple: fulfill the requirement as quickly as possible and return to his life. However, as soon as he stepped through the door, his plans began to unravel. A swarm of children, all eager for attention, surrounded him, their small hands reaching out, their eyes filled with hope. "Will you read us a story?" asked a little girl, her big brown eyes wide and expectant. Martín, who was used to navigating the cutthroat world of business, found himself utterly disarmed by the innocence of the children. Negotiating deals with hardened businessmen was easy compared to the simple, earnest requests of these young souls. As he sat down to read, the weight of his task settled on him. Not just the physical challenge, but the emotional journey he was being forced to undertake. Back at the lawyer's office, as the reading of the will concluded, the reality of what their mother had orchestrated began to sink in. Each sibling, in their way, realized that this was more than just a test of endurance. It was a confrontation with the very values they had long since abandoned. The true inheritance Ines had left them was not one of wealth, but of wisdom. Wisdom that would require them to strip away the layers of pride, ambition, and superficiality to find the essence of what it means to be family. As they embarked on their respective journeys, the weight of Ines' lesson bore down on them. It was a lesson not easily learned, but one that, if taken to heart, could mend the fractures in their souls and, perhaps, in their family as well. "Young man," the voice croaked, breaking through the rhythmic sound of Carlos scrubbing. He looked up to see an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her gray eyes sharp despite her frail appearance. "You remind me of my son. Haven't seen him in years. He got so caught up in his fancy life that he forgot all about me." Carlos froze, the words striking him deeper than he expected. For a moment, he saw his reflection in her eyes, and it wasn't flattering. He forced a smile, trying to shake off the discomfort, but the woman's gaze lingered, cutting through the layers of indifference he had built around himself. She wheeled away slowly, leaving Carlos with a knot in his chest that he couldn't quite untangle. Across town, Gabriela struggled to navigate the small village supermarket with its narrow aisles and shelves that seemed far less glamorous than what she was used to. She eyed the items in her basket, trying to calculate if the meager cash she had been given would cover it all. As she approached the register, her stomach tightened with anxiety. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, noticed Gabriela's hesitation. "First time on a budget?" she asked gently. Gabriela nodded, the vulnerability she had tried to suppress bubbling to the surface. "I don't know how people do this every day," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. The cashier smiled sympathetically. "It's not easy, but you learn to make it work. You find joy in the little things, like getting that extra bit of change at the end of the week." She winked as she handed Gabriela her receipt, and for the first time in a long while, Gabriela felt a genuine connection to someone outside her world of luxury and appearances. Meanwhile, Martín stood at the entrance of the orphanage, trying to steel himself for the day ahead. The echoes of children's laughter filled the air, a sound that tugged at something deep inside him, something he had long buried beneath the weight of his ambitions. As he walked through the door, he was immediately swarmed by eager little faces. One child, a boy no older than 6, tugged at Martín's sleeve. "Mister, will you play with us?" Martín hesitated, feeling out of place. But when the boy's wide, hopeful eyes met his, Martín found himself unable to refuse. He sat down with the children, trying to remember how to let go of the seriousness that had defined his life for so long. As the children's laughter rang out around him, Martín felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw, bit by bit. As night fell over Old Oak, the 3 siblings returned to the Sleeping Oak Inn, each lost in their thoughts. They were physically exhausted, but more than that, they were emotionally drained. None of them would openly admit it, but something had shifted within them that day. A small, subtle change that hinted at the possibility of growth. Carlos, who had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, now found himself questioning the walls he had built to keep others out. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the old woman's words replaying in his mind. They haunted him, forcing him to confront the emptiness he had been too busy to notice. In her room, Gabriella curled up under the thin blanket, feeling strangely exposed. The mask she had worn for years, of wealth, beauty, and control, felt heavy and unnecessary in this simple village. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, releasing years of pent-up emotion that had been hidden beneath layers of perfectionism. Martin, who had always believed success was the ultimate goal, now found himself questioning what he had sacrificed to achieve it. The children's innocent laughter had awakened something in him, a longing for something more meaningful than just climbing the corporate ladder. As they each wrestled with their inner turmoil, Ines sat in her hidden house on the outskirts of the village, listening to Laura recount the day's events. Her heart ached for her children, but she remained resolute. This was the only way. "May God forgive me," she whispered again, her voice heavy with emotion. "But this is the only way to bring them back to who they once were." The village of Old Oak, unaware of the emotional storm brewing within its quiet streets, prepared for another day. But for the siblings, tomorrow promised to bring more than just routine tasks. It would bring deeper confrontations with themselves, with each other, and with the life they had left behind so many years ago. The dawn brought a chill to the air, and with it, the realization that their trials were far from over. Each sibling woke with a sense of dread mixed with the faintest glimmer of hope, unsure of what the day would bring but knowing that something within them had already begun to change. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had been so careful, so sure that she could observe unnoticed. Now, standing behind the tree, her mind raced with excuses, but none seemed sufficient under Carlos' penetrating gaze. His expression was one of curiosity and confusion, but there was something else in his eyes, something softer, less guarded than she was used to seeing. "Carlos," she stammered, stepping out from her hiding spot. I was just walking around town, getting some fresh air." Carlos raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Really? Behind a tree?" Laura couldn't help but laugh, a nervous sound that seemed to break the tension between them. She hadn't expected this version of Carlos, the one who wasn't hidden behind layers of pride and ambition. He looked different, less imposing, more approachable. "You caught me," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I've been keeping an eye on you and the others." Carlos' smile faded as he studied her face, the lines of worry etched into her brow. "Why?" he asked softly, a hint of suspicion creeping into his voice. "What's going on, Laura?" She hesitated, torn between the promise she had made to her aunt and the growing bond she was starting to feel with her cousins. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, the plan, the fake funeral, the lessons their mother wanted them to learn. But the words stuck in her throat. It wasn't time yet. Ines had been clear on that. I wanted to make sure you were all okay," she said, choosing her words carefully. "This can't be easy for any of you." Carlos' expression softened, and he looked away for a moment as if considering her words. When he looked back at her, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that she had never seen before. "It's not," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking a lot lately about everything. About Mom, about the choices I've made. I used to think I had everything figured out, but now, I'm not so sure." Laura's heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice. This was what Ines had hoped for. A crack in the armor, an opening for change. But it was happening slowly, organically, without the force of their mother's plan looming over them. "Maybe, just maybe, this could work." "You're not alone in this, Carlos," Laura said gently. "None of you are. You've got each other, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Carlos looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that felt like a step forward. "Thanks, Laura," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity she hadn't expected. "That means a lot." As he walked away, Laura stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of the secrets she carried. She watched him disappear down the street, feeling the tension between her duty to her aunt and the growing empathy she felt for her cousins. Each of them was beginning to change, to see the world through a different lens. But would it be enough? Would Inés' plan truly heal the fractures that had torn their family apart? When Laura returned to the house where Inés was hiding, she found her aunt sitting by the window, staring out at the sunset. The light bathed Inés' face in a soft, golden glow, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "How are they?" Inés asked, her voice quiet, almost afraid of the answer. Laura sat down beside her, choosing her words carefully. "They're changing, Aunt. Slowly, but it's happening. I saw Carlos today. He's starting to question things. Gabriela too, and Martín. They're all beginning to see things differently." Inés nodded, a small, weary smile tugging at her lips. "I hope this works, Laura. I hope they find their way back to each other. And to me." Laura reached out and took her aunt's hand, squeezing it gently. "They will, Aunt Inés. They just need time. This isn't easy for any of them, but they're stronger than they know." Inés sighed, her eyes distant as she watched the sun dip below the horizon. "May God forgive me," she whispered again, her voice filled with emotion. "But this is the only way." As night fell over Old Oak, the village settled into its quiet routine, unaware of the drama unfolding within its cobbled streets. But for Inés and her children, the journey was far from over. Each step forward brought them closer to the truth, to the love that had been buried beneath years of distance and pride. And with every sunrise, the hope for reconciliation grew stronger, like the first bloom of spring after a long, harsh winter. Carlos stood in the dimly lit hallway, his reflection staring back at him from the streaked mirror. He hardly recognized the man before him. His once pristine appearance was now marred by the weight of the revelations that had just shattered the world he had built. For years, he had prided himself on his success, believing that his achievements were the result of hard work and intelligence. But now, the truth had come crashing down on him like a tidal wave, drowning him in guilt and disillusionment. Alberto Guzman's words echoed in his mind. The image of his father, once a figure of strength and ambition, had crumbled into something far darker. The wealth, the privileges, the life he had lived. It was all stained with the suffering of others. And his mother, Inés, the one person who had tried to stop the madness, had been ignored, her warnings falling on deaf ears. Carlos ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. The revelation was too much to process all at once. He had always believed his mother was just a kind, nurturing presence in the background, someone who supported the family but never truly influenced its trajectory. How wrong he had been. She had seen through the illusions, had known the truth all along, and he had been too blind to see it. As he walked slowly down the hallway, his mind raced with questions. What had his mother thought of him? Had she been disappointed in him all these years, watching as he followed in his father's footsteps without question? The thought tore at his heart, making him feel small and insignificant in a way he hadn't felt since he was a child. The conversation with Laura earlier replayed in his mind, and now, in the harsh light of these new truths, he began to question her presence in Old Oak. Was she here just to visit Aunt Inés' grave? Or was there something more? Something he wasn't seeing? By the time Carlos returned to the Sleeping Oak Inn, he was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The weight of the day's revelations pressed down on him like an anchor, dragging him into a dark place he wasn't sure he could escape. As he entered the room he shared with Martín, he found his younger brother already asleep, his breathing slow and steady in the darkness. Carlos sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, lost in thought. He could hear Gabriela's soft sobs from the room next door, a sound that made his chest tighten. They were all struggling, each in their way, with the challenges the strange journey had forced upon them. But now, with everything he had learned, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that they were all connected by something deeper than just family blood. A shared history that none of them had truly understood until now. As the night wore on, Carlos couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the old man in the nursing home, the regrets that had haunted him, and the way his mother had tried to protect them all from the consequences of their father's decisions. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this journey wasn't just about finishing the tasks laid out in the will. It was about understanding who they were, who their parents had been, and how they had all ended up here. In another part of the village, Laura sat quietly with Ines, recounting the events of the day. As she spoke, she could see the pain etched into her aunt's face, the weight of everything she had done pressing heavily on her fragile shoulders. "Carlos is beginning to see the truth," Laura said softly, watching as Ines closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. "But Aunt Ines, this is hurting him, hurting all of them. Are you sure this is the right way?" Ines opened her eyes, her gaze distant as she stared out the window into the night. "The truth is never easy, Laura, but they needed to know. They needed to see that the lives they've built were based on illusions and mistakes. This is the only way they'll be able to move forward." Laura sighed, her heart heavy with doubt. She had never seen her cousins so vulnerable, so lost. And yet, she couldn't deny that something was changing in them. For better or worse, Ines' plan was working. But at what cost? "Aunt Ines," Laura whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I hope you're right. I hope this will heal them, not break them." Ines reached out and took Laura's hand, her touch warm but trembling. "Sometimes the only way to rebuild something is to break it down first. But we'll see, Laura. We'll see." As the village of Old Oak slept, the prodigal children of Ines slowly began to confront their past, their present, and the uncertain future that awaited them. And in the quiet corners of their hearts, they each felt the stirrings of something new, an unfamiliar sense of humility, of connection, and perhaps, just perhaps, of hope. With trembling hands, Carlos ended the call to his law firm, feeling the weight of his decision settle heavily on his shoulders. He had taken the first step on a path he knew would be difficult, uncertain, and possibly filled with more painful truths. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of relief, an inner peace that came from knowing he was finally doing the right thing. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but Carlos was prepared to face them, no matter the cost. Later that night, as he sat down for dinner with his siblings at the inn, Carlos looked at Gabriela and Martín with a new perspective. They were no longer the competition, the disappointments, or the distant figures he had once seen them as. Now, they were companions on the same difficult journey of redemption, allies in a shared quest for understanding and healing. The dim light of the inn's dining room flickered softly, casting shadows on their faces as they ate in silence. Carlos could feel the tension, the unspoken words hanging in the air, but there was also a quiet solidarity, a recognition that they were all in this together, whether they liked it or not. As the afternoon sun bathed the cobblestone streets of Old Oak, Gabriela made her way to the cafe for her evening shift. The exhaustion of the past few days was etched into her face, but something else had begun to take root within her. An inner strength, a newfound determination to confront the truth about her mother, about herself, and about the life she had been living. The revelations she had uncovered about Ines weighed heavily on her, but they also fueled a desire for change. As she wiped down tables, her attention was drawn to a conversation in the corner. Two elderly women sat sipping tea, their voices hushed but filled with excitement. Gabriela couldn't help but listen, her heart skipping a beat as she overheard the familiar name. "I'm telling you, Matilda, it was her," whispered the first woman, her voice insistent. "It was Ines. I saw her near the old Morales house on the outskirts of town." Gabriela's hand froze, the cloth slipping from her fingers. She quickly bent down to pick it up, her mind racing. Could it be true? Could her mother be alive? She finished her shift in a daze, the old woman's words echoing in her mind. Without hesitation, Gabriela headed for the outskirts of town, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The path to the Morales house was overgrown, the vegetation thick and wild, as if nature had been trying to reclaim the forgotten place. Yet Gabriela pressed on, driven by the possibility of seeing her mother again. When she finally reached the house, Gabriela's breath caught in her throat. Through a window partially obscured by vines, she saw movement, a familiar silhouette with silver hair and a posture that was unmistakably Ines. Gabriela stifled a gasp, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. Couldn't be. Could it? She took a step closer, her heart racing, but stopped herself just before reaching the door. If her mother was alive, what did this mean? Why had she faked her death? What purpose did it serve? Gabriella's mind swirled with questions, each more overwhelming than the last. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the abandoned house, Gabriella finally turned and walked away, her thoughts in turmoil. She couldn't confront her mother, not yet. Not until she understood what was happening. She needed proof, answers, something to make sense of the madness unfolding around her. That night, in the quiet solitude of her room at the inn, Gabriella lay awake, her mind racing. She was torn between hope and dread, between the desire to see her mother again and the fear of what that reunion might mean. Everything she had believed up until now seemed fragile and uncertain, like it could shatter with just one more revelation. And yet, she couldn't let go of the possibility that her mother was still out there, orchestrating something far bigger than she could imagine. Gabriella knew she couldn't share this with Carlos or Martín, not without being sure of what she had seen. They were struggling in their ways, facing their demons, and she couldn't burden them with this, at least not until she had answers. Tomorrow, she would return to the Morales house, and she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. With that resolution, Gabriella finally closed her eyes, though sleep eluded her. She knew that whatever she found, it would change everything. For her brothers, and for the legacy of their mother that was still unfolding in ways none of them had anticipated. At dawn, Inés paced anxiously in the living room of the old Morales house. Laura's news about Gabriella's near discovery had rattled her more than she cared to admit. Her carefully orchestrated plan, which had seemed so foolproof, now felt like it was hanging by a thread. Each step, once calculated with precision, now seemed precarious. "Aunt, we need to reconsider this," Laura insisted, her voice laced with urgency. "Things are getting too complicated. Gabriella is suspicious, and the others, they're changing, Aunt. They're changing." Inés paused, her gaze drifting out the window to the horizon of the town she once knew so intimately. The landscape of Old Oak, both familiar and distant, seemed to reflect the turmoil in her heart. "Maybe you're right, my dear," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her doubts. "But what if it's just a facade? What if they revert to their old ways as soon as they think the inheritance is secured?" Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. It was the lawyer, arriving for his weekly report. Inés braced herself, but nothing could have prepared her for what he would reveal. "Martín has begun the adoption process for Pedrito," the lawyer said, his tone reflecting his surprise at the news. "And not only that, he's using his contacts to improve conditions at the orphanage." Inés sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the information. "My Martín, the same one who once said children were a waste of time and money?" she asked in disbelief. The lawyer nodded, continuing. "And Carlos has ordered a full audit of his law firm in New York. It seems he's preparing for a large-scale legal confession, or perhaps rectification." "And Gabriella?" Inés asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. The lawyer glanced at his notes before answering. "She's canceled all her social engagements for the next month. According to my sources, she's organizing a charity fair with the local merchants." Silence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. Inés looked at Laura, seeing in her niece's eyes the same inner conflict she felt. Her plan had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes, yet the emotional cost seemed higher than she had anticipated. "Aunt," Laura said gently, "I think it's time to tell them the truth." Inés closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had set this plan into motion to teach her children the value of empathy, hard work, and connection. But now she was faced with a new fear, that she had gone too far, that she might lose them forever. "I need time," Inés whispered, her voice breaking. "Just a little more time to be sure." After the lawyer left and Laura prepared for another day of surveillance, Inés remained alone with her thoughts. She looked at the photos of her children, the ones she had brought with her to this hiding place, and for the first time since she had conceived of this plan, she allowed herself to cry. The tears were a complex mixture of pride for the changes she was witnessing in her children and deep regret for the suffering she had caused them. The line between love and manipulation had blurred, and Ines now found herself teetering dangerously close to the edge. Outside, the midday sun shone relentlessly over Old Oak, yet the town buzzed with renewed energy. At the heart of this vitality were Ines's children, unknowingly driven by the lessons she had crafted for them. In the main square, Carlos, his sleeves rolled up and his usually immaculate hair disheveled, sat amidst a group of elderly villagers and young families. He had set up an impromptu legal clinic, offering advice to anyone who needed it. "Don't worry, Dona Mercedes," he reassured an elderly woman whose eyes brimmed with tears. "We'll make sure you get the pension you're entitled to. It's your right." A few streets away, Gabriella, once the epitome of high society, now sat at the cafe where she worked, leading a meeting with the town's merchants. The room buzzed with ideas and energy as they planned a charity fair. "We could use the square for the stalls," Gabriella suggested, her voice filled with an excitement that had been missing from her life for years. "All the proceeds will go directly to renovating the elementary school." Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Martin knelt in the yard, his hands covered in dirt as he helped the children plant a garden. His suit jackets and conference calls felt a world away as he encouraged little Pedrito, who was struggling to dig a hole. "That's right, Pedrito," Martin said with a smile, guiding the boy's hands. "The carrot needs space to grow, just like you do." As the day progressed, Old Oak continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the drama unfolding beneath the surface. But for Carlos, Gabriella, and Martin, the lessons they were learning went far deeper than the tasks they were assigned. Each of them was beginning to find a new sense of purpose, a new connection to the world around them, and to the values their mother had tried to instill in them long ago. And for Ines, watching from the shadows of the Morales house, the conflict between her intentions and the reality of her plan continued to grow. The changes in her children were undeniable, but so was the pain she had caused. As she stared at the photos of her children, Ines knew that the time to reveal the truth was approaching. Yet, deep down, she feared that even the best of intentions might not be enough to heal the wounds she had created. Carlos's gaze hardened with concern and suspicion as he watched Laura struggle with her words. The usually composed and confident Laura seemed on the brink of breaking down, and it only fueled his growing unease. He could sense that something was seriously wrong, something that had been simmering beneath the surface of their interactions for weeks now. "Laura," he said softly, trying to coax the truth from her. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. We've been through so much together already." Laura looked into his eyes, seeing the genuine worry there, and felt the walls she had built around her secret begin to crumble. The weight of the deception, the lies, and the pain she had witnessed in her cousins had taken a toll on her. She could no longer carry the burden alone. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, the sound of footsteps approaching interrupted them. Gabriella emerged from the cafe, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw her brother and cousin standing together on the cobblestone street. "What's going on?" Gabriella asked, sensing the tension in the air. Her gaze flicked between Carlos and Laura, reading the unease on both of their faces. Laura hesitated, torn between her loyalty to her aunt and the growing bond she had developed with her cousins. She knew that once she revealed the truth, everything would change. But she also knew that the time for half-truths and secrets had come to an end. Before she could answer, Martin joined them, having just left the orphanage. He took one look at the scene before him and immediately sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Is everything okay?" Martin asked, his voice tinged with concern. Laura looked at the three siblings standing before her, each of them having changed so much in such a short time. They were no longer the distant, self-absorbed people they had been when this journey began. They had grown, learned, and rediscovered parts of themselves that had been lost or buried. Taking a deep breath, Laura made her decision. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Everything is not okay. There's something you all need to know. Something that will change everything." Carlos, Gabriella, and Martin exchanged glances, the atmosphere growing heavier with anticipation. Laura swallowed hard and began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Auntie Ness, she's not dead." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the quiet street. Shock, disbelief, and confusion painted their faces as they processed what Laura had just said. "What do you mean she's not dead?" Carlos demanded, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. "We went to her funeral, Laura." Gabriella's hand flew to her mouth, her suspicions about the rumors she had overheard now crashing into reality. Martine simply stared, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. Laura quickly continued, afraid she might lose her nerve. "The funeral was staged, Auntie Ness. She did it to teach you all a lesson, to show you the value of family, empathy, and hard work. She's been watching you this whole time, seeing how you would react, hoping you would change." Silence fell over the group as the enormity of Laura's revelation sank in. Each sibling grappled with a torrent of emotions: betrayal, hurt, confusion, and the dawning realization of why their mother had gone to such extreme lengths. Gabriella was the first to speak, her voice choked with emotion. "All this time, she was alive, watching us, testing us?" Carlos's fists clenched at his sides as he struggled to contain his anger. "And you knew? You were part of this? All of you manipulated us? Lied to us?" Laura nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I did it because I believed it was the right thing, that it would help you all see what mattered. But I never imagined it would hurt you so much." Martine, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, his voice soft but filled with hurt. "We were grieving, Laura. We thought we'd lost her. And all this time, it was just a lie." Laura's tears spilled over as she saw the pain in their eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Auntie Ness never wanted to hurt you. She just wanted you to find your way back to each other, and to the values she tried to teach you." The silence that followed was suffocating. None of them knew what to say or how to react. The person they loved most in the world, the one they had mourned, had been alive all along, orchestrating a grand deception to guide them back to their roots. Finally, Carlos broke the silence, his voice calm but filled with a deep sadness. "Where is she?" Laura hesitated, then answered, "She's at the old Morales house, just outside of town. She's been there the whole time, watching everything." Without another word, Carlos turned and began walking in the direction of the house. Gabriella and Martine exchanged a glance before following him. Laura watched them go, her heart heavy with regret and fear of what would happen next. As the siblings made their way to the Morales house, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across Old Oak. They walked in silence, each lost in their thoughts, their emotions a tangled mix of anger, sorrow, and a desperate need for answers. When they finally reached the house, they stood in front of the door, hesitating. This was the moment of truth, the moment they would confront the mother who had pushed them to the brink in the hope of saving them. Carlos was the first to step forward, his hand trembling as he knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness, and after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. There stood Ines, her eyes wide with shock and tears brimming at the sight of her children. The confrontation she had been dreading, and yet knew was inevitable, had finally arrived. For a long moment, they all stood there, staring at one another, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. Finally, Ines spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "Please come in," she whispered, stepping aside to let them inside. As they entered the house, the siblings knew that nothing would ever be the same. The journey they had started was far from over, but for the first time, they would face it together as a family. In the waiting room of the hospital, an oppressive silence settled over the family as the weight of the situation pressed down on them. The shock of seeing Ines alive was momentarily eclipsed by the fear for Pedrito's life. Carlos, Gabriella, Martine, and Laura sat together, their minds racing, each consumed by their mix of emotions: anger, confusion, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. But at that moment, All that truly mattered was the boy lying in the operating room, fighting for his life. Martin's hands shook as he tried to process everything. His mother, whom he had grieved, standing there, alive and giving consent for Pedrito's operation. He hadn't had time to react, to question, to demand answers. All he could think about was Pedrito, the little boy who had wormed his way into his heart, and who had become more than just a responsibility. Pedrito was family now, in every sense of the word. Carlos, usually composed and analytical, sat staring at the hospital floor, his mind still reeling from the revelation of his mother's survival. The anger that had initially surged through him was now tempered by the gravity of the situation. His thoughts bounced between the betrayal he felt and his concern for Pedrito. He glanced over at Ines, who was sitting silently, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. She had taken charge in the crisis, stepping into a role she had always embraced. The protector, the decision-maker. But the weight of her deception loomed large, and Carlos wasn't sure how to reconcile the mother who had raised him with the woman who had orchestrated this elaborate plan. Gabriela, sitting next to Carlos, couldn't stop staring at her mother. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from fear for Pedrito, but from the overwhelming emotions of seeing Ines alive after all this time. She had mourned her mother, grieved for her loss, and now, here she was, standing before them as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The shock, the lies, the betrayal. It all threatened to suffocate her. Yet Gabriela knew they had to get through this moment before anything else could be addressed. Laura sat quietly, feeling the enormity of what she had done. She had brought them all to this point, and now they were all in the same room, bound by a secret that had been exposed. The reunion she had imagined, with explanations and forgiveness, had been overshadowed by Pedrito's emergency, and now she could only hope that the boy would pull through so that the family could begin to heal. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew unbearable. Finally, the door to the operating room swung open, and the doctor appeared, his face serious but calm. The family shot to their feet, their eyes locked on him, desperate for news. The surgery was successful, the doctor said, his voice reassuring. Pedrito is stable, but it was a close call. He'll need time to recover, but we're optimistic. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Martin covered his face with his hands, the weight of his emotions finally catching up with him as tears streamed down his cheeks. Carlos placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, offering silent support, while Gabriela wiped away her tears, overwhelmed with gratitude. Ines, standing apart from her children, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fear of losing Pedrito, coupled with the weight of her actions, had threatened to crush her. But now, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to begin mending the broken bonds of her family. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and that forgiveness might not come quickly. But for now, Pedrito was safe, and that was enough. The doctor continued, "You can see him soon, but he'll need rest. Only one visitor at a time for now." Martin, still wiping his tears, looked to the others. "I'll go first if that's okay." The family nodded in agreement, understanding the deep connection Martin had formed with Pedrito. As Martin followed the doctor down the hall, the remaining family members stood together in silence, the weight of the moment still heavy in the air. After a long pause, Carlos finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk, Mom." Ines looked at her children, her eyes filled with regret and love. "I know," she replied softly. "We do." The conversation that had been delayed by crisis could no longer be avoided. Some questions needed answers, emotions that needed to be addressed. And though the path ahead would be difficult, the family knew that this moment, together in the hospital waiting room, was the first step toward healing the wounds that had been inflicted. As they sat back down, ready to begin the difficult conversation, Ines looked at each of her children and said, "I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to save you from losing yourselves. But maybe I went too far." Carlos, Gabriela, and Laura listened, their expressions a mix of empathy and anger, knowing that while the road ahead was uncertain, it was a journey they would have to take together. As the early morning light filtered into the hospital cafe, The Morales family sat together, emotions heavy in the air, but the first signs of healing slowly beginning to surface. The night had been long, filled with revelations, tears, and moments of unexpected understanding. Now, in the aftermath of the storm, there was a quietness between them, a space where forgiveness might find room to grow. Ines, sitting at the center of it all, looked at her children with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She had never intended for things to go this far, but seeing the changes in her children, Carlos's newfound humility, Gabriella's compassion, and Martine's sense of purpose, made her believe that, perhaps, she hadn't lost them after all. It had taken extreme measures, but they had rediscovered parts of themselves they had buried under years of ambition, pride, and distance. Carlos, still reeling from the revelations of the night, looked at his mother with a mixture of emotions. He had been angry, hurt, betrayed. But now, as he sat there, he couldn't deny the truth of what she had said. They had lost their way. The lives they had built were impressive on the surface, but underneath, they were hollow, disconnected from the values that had once been so important to their family. "I don't know how to feel, Mom," he admitted quietly. "What you did, it's hard to forgive, but I can't ignore the fact that you're right. We needed something to shake us out of the lives we were living." Gabriella, who had spent so many years wrapped up in a world of appearances and superficial connections, nodded in agreement. "I was so caught up in my own life," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't even see how far I had drifted from the person I used to be. These past weeks, they've been hard, but I've learned so much. I've seen things I never would have noticed before, and I've felt things I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years." Martine, who had always prided himself on his independence and ambition, found himself grappling with a different reality. The time he had spent at the orphanage had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. Pedrito's presence in his life had forced him to confront the parts of himself that he had neglected, the part that longed for connection, for family, for something more than just success. "I've always thought of myself as self-sufficient," he said, his voice filled with quiet realization. "But these past weeks have shown me how wrong I was. We need each other, Mom. We need family." Ines listened to her children, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She had feared she would lose them forever, that the drastic steps she had taken would drive them further away. But now, hearing their words, seeing the changes in their faces, she realized that maybe, just maybe, her plan had worked. Not in the way she had imagined, but in a way that mattered. She reached across the table, taking each of their hands in hers. "I'm so proud of all of you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You found your way back to each other, and that's all I ever wanted. I know what I did was extreme, and I'm so sorry for the pain I caused. But seeing you now, I believe it was worth it." For a long moment, they sat there in silence, holding hands, letting the emotions wash over them. There were still wounds to heal, still conversations to be had, but in that moment, they were united in a way they hadn't been in years. As the morning wore on, they began to talk more openly, sharing stories of the past weeks, of the challenges they had faced and the lessons they had learned. Laughter mixed with tears as they began to rebuild the bonds that had been broken. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but the love between them was stronger than the hurt. Later that day, they visited Pedrito in his hospital room. The little boy, pale but smiling, was overjoyed to see Martine and the rest of the family. As they crowded around his bed, the room filled with warmth and hope. Martine, who had once been so focused on his career and success, now found himself thinking about the future in a different way. A future that included Pedrito as part of the family. As they stood there together, Ines watched her children, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. The road ahead would still be difficult, but they had taken the first steps toward healing. And now, with Pedrito recovering and her family reunited, she believed that they could face whatever challenges the future held. Together, the dawn of a new chapter had begun for the Morales family, one built on love, understanding, and the rediscovery of the values that had always been at the heart of who they were. Ines smiled at Gabriella's words, feeling a surge of warmth and hope. "Then that's where we start, together," she said softly, looking at each of her children with love and pride. The kitchen, once filled with tension and unresolved issues, now felt like a place of healing, a space where they could begin again. Carlos, still holding his mother's hand, sighed deeply. "You're right, Mom. Every day is a choice. I've been making the wrong ones for so long. But now I want to do better. We all do." He glanced at his siblings, and they nodded in agreement. There was no turning back from the realizations they had come to, no erasing the lessons they had learned. They had changed, and there was no going back to the people they had once been. "I'll be here too," Carlos added. "I need to set things right, not just with the law firm, but with myself. And I think that has to start here with all of us." Martín, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, smiled at his brother's words. "Old Oak might just be the place for all of us to heal. Pedrito needs me here, and I want to be here for him, and for all of you." Gabriella reached across the table and squeezed her brother's hands. "We're in this together," she said. "Let's not just talk about making a difference. Let's do it. For ourselves, for this town, for everyone we've let down along the way." Ines, watching her children connect in ways she hadn't seen in years, felt tears prickling in her eyes. Her plan, as extreme as it had been, had led them here, to this moment of unity and shared purpose. They had rediscovered what it meant to be a family, and now they had the opportunity to build something new, something lasting. The conversation continued through breakfast, with plans being made, ideas being shared, and commitments being forged. They talked about the charity fair, the orphanage, and the ways they could contribute to the community that had welcomed them back with open arms. For the first time in years, they were excited about the future, excited to be working together not just as individuals but as a family. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the kitchen in warm light, Ines looked around the table and smiled. Her children had found their way back to each other and to her. The path had been long and painful, but it had brought them to a place of understanding and renewal. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew that they would face those challenges together. That afternoon, the Morales family took a walk through Old Oak, side by side. The villagers greeted them warmly, no longer seeing them as outsiders, but as part of the community. They stopped at the cafe where Gabriella had worked, chatted with the merchants who had become her friends, and visited the orphanage where Martín was greeted with hugs from the children. Carlos offered legal advice to those in need, and Ines watched it all with quiet pride. As the day came to an end, they returned to the old family home. The house, which had once been filled with silence and memories, now hummed with life. They spent the evening together, talking, laughing, and planning for the future. As they finally settled in for the night, each of them felt a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. In the days that followed, the Morales family continued to rebuild their lives in Old Oak. The charity fair that Gabriella had organized was a resounding success, raising funds to renovate the local school and support the orphanage. Martín officially adopted Pedrito, and together they began to build a life filled with love and purpose. Carlos set up a small legal clinic in town, offering his services to those who couldn't afford representation, while also working to rectify the mistakes of the past. Ines, watching it all unfold, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her children had found their way not just back to her, but to themselves. They had become the people she had always believed they could be, and now they were using their gifts to make a difference in the world. The future was uncertain, as it always is, but the Morales family faced it with hope, love, and a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they had found their way back to what truly mattered, each other, and that was the greatest victory of all. The day of the charity fair was a sight to behold. Old Oak, with its quiet streets and simple charm, had been transformed into a lively hub of activity. The stalls were brimming with handmade goods, fresh produce, and delicious food, all donated by the townspeople. There were games for children, music in the air, and a palpable sense of community that had been rekindled by the efforts of the Morales family. Gabriella, who had once thrived on high society events, found herself in her element in this small-town fair. She greeted everyone with a warm smile, her floral dress swaying as she moved effortlessly between the booths, making sure everything was running smoothly. Lucia, standing beside her, offered a grin of admiration as they set up the decorated pastries. "This is incredible, Gabriella," Lucia said, watching as families gathered around the stalls, children running and laughing with excitement. "You've brought the whole town together." Gabriella beamed, her heart full. "I didn't do it alone. This is all of us working together." Nearby, Carlos was talking with some of the townspeople who had come to him for legal help. His improvised office in the library had become a popular spot, and now, even at the fair, people approached him for advice. He listened patiently, offering guidance where he could, and for the first time, he felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond his usual high-stakes cases. As Carlos finished a conversation with an elderly couple, he spotted Don Alberto standing at a distance, watching the fair with a heavy expression. Carlos approached him, the conversation they had shared a few days earlier still weighing on his mind. "Don Alberto," Carlos greeted, his tone softer than usual. "How are you holding up?" The old man sighed, his gaze fixed on the lively scene before him. "Seeing all this, it makes me wonder what we've done with our lives, Carlos. The deals we made, the people we hurt, it wasn't worth it." Carlos placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "We can't change the past, Don Alberto, but we can make amends now. We can help build something better." Don Alberto nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. "I want to help, Carlos. Whatever you need, I'm here." Carlos smiled, feeling a sense of peace at that moment. "We'll do it together, Don Alberto. We'll make things right." Across the square, Martín was supervising the installation of the new playground equipment at the orphanage's booth. Pedrito, now recovered and full of energy, was beside him, his small hands helping to arrange the colorful flowers that would decorate the playground. Martín felt a sense of calm he had never experienced before, a deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was making a real difference in these children's lives. As he worked, Martín's phone rang. It was his former business partner, the one who had criticized his decision to stay in Old Oak. Martín answered calmly, already knowing what the conversation would entail. "Martín." His partner's voice came through the line, frustrated and incredulous. "Are you going through with this? You're throwing everything away for what? Some small-town charity project?" Martín looked around at the fair, at the children's laughter and the sense of community that surrounded him. He smiled as he watched Pedrito playing nearby, his heart full. "I'm not throwing anything away," Martín replied with quiet conviction. "For the first time in my life, I'm building something that truly matters." His partner's voice faded into the background as Martín ended the call, his decision final. He was where he needed to be, and that was all that mattered. The day passed in a blur of joy and laughter, with the fair exceeding everyone's expectations. The school renovation fund grew with every purchase, and the orphanage received more donations than ever before. The whole town felt the impact of the Morales family's efforts, and gratitude flowed through the streets like a gentle river. That evening, as the sun began to set and the fair wound down, the Morales family gathered together on the porch of their old family home. The day had been a success in every sense, but more importantly, it had solidified their newfound connection to each other and the town. Ines, sitting in her favorite rocking chair, looked at her children with pride. They had come so far, each of them embracing a new path, a new way of being. The plan she had set in motion, though unconventional, had brought them to this moment. Stronger, more united, and with a deeper sense of purpose. She raised her glass of lemonade in a toast. "To the mistakes that brought us here," she said softly, "and to the love that will keep us together." Her children smiled and lifted their glasses, clinking them together in agreement. The future, once filled with uncertainty, now seemed full of promise. They had found their way back to each other and to the values that had once defined their family. And now, they faced that future together, with hope and love guiding their way. Carlos looked up from his legal booth, watching the crowd move through the fair, and for a brief moment, He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment. Helping people, really making a difference in their lives, filled him with satisfaction that no corporate victory had ever given him. The elderly woman he had just helped clasped his hand with gratitude before she left, and Carlos smiled, knowing that he had made a real impact on her life. At the same time, Martín watched Pedrito play in the children's area, his heart swelling with pride and love. When Pedrito called him Dad for the first time, Martín's world shifted. That single word meant everything to him. It was a confirmation that he was more than just a successful businessman. He was a father now, and the love he had for Pedrito gave his life a new depth of meaning that no amount of money could ever provide. Inés sat on a nearby bench, watching her children, her heart full. Laura, who had been by her side throughout the entire journey, handed her a glass of lemonade, and they shared a quiet moment of reflection. "Auntie," Laura asked gently, "did you ever think it would turn out like this?" Inés shook her head, blinking back tears. "Never in my wildest dreams, Laura. I hoped. But this, what I'm seeing now, is more than I ever dared to imagine. They've not only found their way back to me, but to themselves and each other." Laura smiled and squeezed her aunt's hand. "You did it, Auntie. You brought them back together." Inés sighed softly, watching as her children worked together to keep the fair running smoothly. "No," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "They did it themselves. All I did was give them the push they needed." As the day wore on, the spirit of community spread through Old Oak like wildfire. The townspeople, who had once seen the Morales family as aloof and disconnected, now viewed them as integral members of the community. Gabriela coordinated with merchants and volunteers, her once flawless exterior now replaced by genuine warmth and enthusiasm. She moved through the fair with ease, making everyone feel included and appreciated. Carlos continued to offer legal advice, his glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed cases and paperwork. But unlike the cold, impersonal cases he used to handle, these matters were close to home, affecting real people with real lives. It was a far cry from the boardrooms of New York, but it was exactly where he needed to be. Martín, with Pedrito always at his side, worked tirelessly to make sure the children's area was a success. He watched with pride as the children played on the new equipment, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that he was helping to create a better future for them. As night fell and the fair began to wind down, the family gathered in the center of the square, bathed in the warm glow of the streetlights. Carlos stood up to address the crowd, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the townspeople. "We've done something incredible today," he announced, his tone full of pride and hope. "We've raised double the amount we expected for the school renovation, and that's because of all of you, because of this community coming together to make a difference." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Carlos smiled as he stepped back to allow Gabriela to speak. "This is just the beginning," Gabriela said, her voice filled with excitement. "We have so much more we can do together. This fair is only the start of what we can accomplish. We're already planning more community initiatives, and we want all of you to be a part of it." The applause grew louder, and Gabriela beamed, her heart swelling with joy at the thought of what lay ahead. Martín, holding Pedrito in his arms, spoke next. "I've learned so much from this town, from all of you, and this little guy right here," he said, hugging Pedrito close. "We're going to expand the support program for the orphanage. Every child deserves a chance, and together, we can make that happen." The crowd's cheers and applause filled the square, and as fireworks lit up the night sky, marking the end of the fair, the Morales family came together in a tight embrace. Inés, at the center of it all, felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. The plan she had put in motion out of desperation had blossomed into something far more beautiful than she ever could have imagined. Her children were not only united, but they were also thriving, connected to the town and to the people whose lives they had touched. As they stood there, watching the fireworks burst in brilliant colors above them, the Morales family knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but now they had something far more important than wealth or success. They had each other, and that was the greatest treasure of all. As the final fireworks faded from the sky and the night grew quiet, The Morales family walked home together, their hearts light and their spirits high. The future was uncertain, as it always is, but they knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. And in that unity, they had found their greatest strength. This ending beautifully captures the essence of transformation, love, and the rediscovery of what truly matters in life. The story of the Morales family has come full circle, showing the power of forgiveness, connection, and the courage to change. The symbolism of the blooming garden, the laughter, and the celebration of Inés' birthday paints a vivid picture of a family and community that has been reborn from the ashes of their past mistakes. The way the characters reflect on their growth, acknowledging how their mother's drastic decision led them to a deeper understanding of life, brings closure to the emotional journey they've been on. Each sibling's realization, Carlos finding purpose in helping others, Gabriela finding beauty in kindness, and Martín finding wealth in love, resonates as a powerful message of how personal growth and transformation can lead to a more fulfilling and meaningful life. Inés' words, full of wisdom and gratitude, tie everything together, emphasizing that sometimes we have to experience loss to truly appreciate what we gain. The scene is filled with warmth and the light of hope, showing that despite the uncertainties ahead, the Morales family has discovered a new way of living, one rooted in compassion, love, and a sense of shared purpose. The closing invitation to the audience is heartfelt and encouraging, making it clear that the lessons learned by the Morales family are universal and can inspire anyone watching. The story doesn't end here. Rather, it opens the door to new beginnings and possibilities, inviting viewers to reflect on their own lives and relationships. This conclusion perfectly encapsulates the journey from hardship to redemption and the beauty of a life lived in connection with others. It's a touching and uplifting ending that leaves a lasting impression. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with the Morales family. Their story of transformation, love, and the rediscovery of what truly matters serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes we need to lose something to gain everything. But now it's your turn. What have you learned from their experience? What is one thing from this story that you will bring into your own life? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your reflections in the comments below. Let us know how this story has touched you and what lessons you plan to put into practice. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a comment, give it a like, and share it with others. And of course, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Blessings.